Hello, everybody. Some other people are joining. Um, I think that as we go on, other people will join. If you do hear a kind of doorbell sound, that will be people joining in as we go along, and I'll let them in. Um, this session is being recorded. Thank you very much to Bill White. He's given me permission to record it. Just so that you know, if you don't want your video camera on for that reason, then please, by all means, turn it off. I would like to welcome William A. White III, Bill White, to virtual Durham. He's still in California, where it's lovely, sunny, and you can see a lovely landscape here. This is not my experience today, although there's a very lovely river that I went walking by. Um, Bill and I have only met once online, but we've kind of met more through email. And I got in touch with him, I think, on the advice of Kenneth Aitchison when I was researching for a talk that I was giving in Bermuda in 2019 on why archaeology is so white, a topic which, of course, has been addressed over the years by a number of scholars, and mostly Black archaeologists like Maria Franklin, whose papers I was turning to. And so I got in touch with Bill, and he was very generous and kind with his resources and time, and provided me with huge lists of readings and access to his, or at least pointer to his blog, where he has been talking about this very subject for some time. Um, it happened that when I was giving the talk in Bermuda, Sapiens got in touch with me and asked me to do an article on the basis of the talk, and I quickly pointed out that it wasn't really that was hardly the point, and so I really thought that we should be asking a Black archaeologist to do this, especially since there are many people who've been writing about this sort of stuff for some time. So I got in touch with Bill, who very gladly agreed to be the lead author on that. And some of you may have read that article, which came out, and I think Bill might be going on to talk about that a little bit. But it's been a real pleasure, I have to say, to make his acquaintance. For those of you who haven't read the blurb on the site, Bill is a lecturer or a professor at assistant professor, whichever words you want to use, at University of California, Berkeley. He's a specialist in historical archaeology, and of course works in the United States context, and also is an expert in cultural resource management archaeology. And started, Bill, your blog really with that in mind, and he's produced many resources for cultural resource management and archaeologists who are working in the field in the United States. So of course, Bill's talk is related to the United States context, but especially since, I would say even since 2019, but especially of course since 2020, we're all much more on the same page, I think. And one of the things that I know that people from Badger on Facebook were wondering about is how this kind of vision of archaeology as something that can help to create a more equitable society can be applied in the UK. So that might be something which comes up in the discussion afterwards. I don't expect Bill to necessarily have answers for that, not having worked in the UK, but I think it could be a really productive conversation between the people that we have online today and Bill, with all of his experience and knowledge of the US field. So I'm going to stop talking myself now. I will thank Bill very much again for joining us, and I will hand over to you to start your talk. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks, Catherine, for that great introduction. Yeah, that pretty much covers it all. I'm an assistant professor here at UC Berkeley. This image you see here is very similar to what it is like outside. That's why so many people live in California, because this is how the weather is a lot. So sorry if I'm in a kind of a jovial, happy mood because the weather is really nice. But I'm here to give a talk to you all, and I will do my very best to make sure that it's not too long, so that we have plenty of time to talk at the end. But the talk today is going to focus on anti-racism in archaeology as a pathway towards building a trauma-informed, excuse me, pathway towards building a trauma-informed response to the complicated lives that we all have here in the Anthropocene, where things are changing faster than anyone can even imagine them. So I know a lot of folks are in all different kinds of places, but I'm sitting here in my office in Berkeley, California, which is on unceded land of the Ohlone people. And I'm wearing a black shirt with a gray long sleeve shirt underneath that has a collar. I have short black hair. Well, it used to be black, but now it's got gray in it, and I have a beard, and I have a brown skin color. And when I smile, my voice is pretty happy. So I want to first start off just telling everyone that, this is going to be extremely focused on the North American experience. I mean, I've spent about 20 years doing archaeology in the United States. Most of that career has been in the American West, but I've done projects in the eastern part of the country. I have an ongoing project in the Caribbean right now, and I also have done work in the upper Midwest. So, the way that I look at things comes from my experience. I was born in the United States. And so, apologies if this is too American-centric of a presentation, but I'm always open to learn. So at the end, I hope that we have plenty of time for questions and comments, so I can learn a little bit more about what's going on there, and maybe we can compare strategies. Okay, first I want to start off with, opening up with the article that Dr. Draycott and I did write, called "Why the Whiteness of Archaeology is a Problem." It was picked up by Sapiens magazine, July 7th, 2020. So that's almost 2 years ago. It's crazy to think all the stuff that's happened in those last 18 months since that was published. But I encourage folks to check it out. It's not a very long read, but it kind of summarizes the situation that we're all having with trying to figure out how we can increase diversity in archaeology. This has been an ongoing thing that's been happening through my entire career. And I know the folks who trained me, this was already an issue when they were graduates in college. So I'd say definitely the last 30 years in the United States, folks have been critiquing and asking and wondering how we can get more people of color to be involved in archaeology. And so the article that we published in Sapiens was just kind of the most recent statement in a long series of critiques and statements that have been going on by archaeologists for quite a while. And since that article was published, I checked on the stats. It's been viewed over 44,800 times. It's been shared on Facebook and Twitter over 3,300 times, and it's still viewed about 20 times a day. There's some times when it's viewed 40 or 50 times a day, but in the entire time since it was published, 20 people a day are still looking at this article. And because it was published online, it existed in the unfolding and very lively conversations that happen on the internet and social media spaces. But the overwhelming response to the piece was, folks acknowledging and recognizing the problem is the system in which archaeology is taking place. It's not necessarily always the people who are doing the archaeology. It's the environment and everything that's behind how we're doing cultural resource management, how we recruit students, the entire system of how we create professors, the entire system of how we create PhDs, and how our archaeology a lot of times is disconnected from really the communities in which we're working, right? And all of those things have their origins in how archaeology was created as a craft and as a field of inquiry. So, like I said, the majority of folks, you can see there's 152 comments on this Facebook sharing. There's other times this has been shared on Facebook, but the majority of the people just said, yeah, this is the problem. We need to aim at the structures. That's the way that we're going to increase diversity. But then misdirect or, try to create some kind of space. Oh, is my recording still working, Catherine? I just got a notification.
Yeah, it is. You broke out a little bit there, but you came back in, so it's okay.
I'm a professor. I can just keep talking.
Indeed, indeed.
uh, okay. So yeah, then there was also quite a bit of individuals who just didn't want to really engage in that kind of discussion that race would even have anything to do with it. And they, were making the kind of questions that deflects into kind of a color blindness aspect. Of course, there's some people who, I guess they really loved our piece so much that, they wanted to critique it and, talk about how it's just so ignorant that we would put these kind of, identity politics, something pure science like archaeology, and who cares who's doing the archaeology, who cares what their race is, who cares about their gender, because that doesn't actually matter at all to archaeology. And then, of course, there was some people who just wanted to leave the world because they read an article that we published that mentioned that there would even be race as part of it. And, the bottom one, a lot of times I think the same thing, what am I going to do with all these idiots? But I'm pretty sure that the commenter there is actually meaning that I'm the idiot. And so maybe they know something that I don't. But the article now, after it's been out for so long, I've been thinking about this, and we never really put this in there. We weren't clear enough to say that the problem is not that there's people of white racial identity in archaeology. The biggest problem is that there's not people who will advocate against structural inequality and racism that are archaeologists. So for the rest of the talk, I kind of want to break down those 4 responses to this article. First address that, structural racism, unless you've been living under a bridge, you understand that's the name of the game in our societies in which we live. Because we grow up in these societies, we're not colorblind. We all have been acculturated to understand these different racial differences. And, we bring who we are to the table as archaeologists every time we do anything. So there's no real way that the people who are practicing archaeology can be colorblind. And, it's not ignorant to be an anti-racist. It's an actual pragmatic response to the kind of crazy world that we're living in. And the fact that for hundreds of years, we have these entire segments of society that have had disproportionately less access to everything from education, food, healthcare, everything. And as we watch this pandemic unfold, becoming an anti-racist is really an empathetic response to what's going on in our societies. And then, towards the end, I can acknowledge and tell people who don't want to engage in this exactly where they can go. Okay, so I want to first clarify some of the things I'm going to talk about here. Now, this is coming off of some research and some things that I've learned about the the nonviolence movement that was, really popularized by Martin Luther King in the United States, that was building on other famous civil disobedience programs. Most closely, Dr. King followed Mohandas Gandhi's work, but just the mass civil disobedience and refusal to comply is a form of nonviolence that's been used by people for a long time, thousands of years. But those folks who are part of the Kingian nonviolent school, they like to explain that there's a clear difference between people who are nonviolent versus people who practice nonviolence, right? So in this school of nonviolence talk, they say that nonviolence is essentially not participating or contributing to violence. For example, if we see someone being attacked on the street and we pull our phone out and we watch them, and we record it, or we just stand there and watch it all happen without doing anything to stop it or to even make any kind of a statement, that is a form of nonviolence. If we allow people in our society to have negative statements made about them and we never stand up to defend them, we are practicing nonviolence, right? But an actual person who's practicing nonviolence in the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King is an individual who is stepping up and actively taking a stand against violence in our society. And Martin Luther King also talked about negative peace versus true peace. And negative peace is just silencing individuals who are stepping out of line and causing problems and bringing up issues who are difficult, so that there can be a lack of statement and a lack of movement, and basically a lack of unmuddying the waters, versus the actual abiding peace that's living and working in equanimity and being okay with the situation you're in, and making sure that others around you also can work in peace and equanimity. And so I true to all archaeological form, applied the same concept to my talk today. Anti-racism is the act of not being racist. And so, yeah, as we're just sitting at our house eating popcorn, we are actually being, anti-racist. As we, go about our day and step over individuals who have unequal access, close our minds off from the people who don't have access to things, and we see others doing racist acts, overtly racist, or even, microaggressions, and we just let them all go, that can be considered a version of anti-racism. And in the world in which we live, where organizations make statements where they are against African American violence, and they make statements saying that they're against Asian American Pacific Islander violence, and then they do nothing to change their entire system, all of those people are anti-racist. But true people who are following anti-racism as a praxis and a way of holding themselves are confronting those structures. They don't stay quiet when those statements are made. They don't allow these things to go on forever, and they actually work with their own capacity and their own ability to confront this kind of situation in society. And that's what I argue we need more of in archaeology. So the first one, right, that structural racism is real. Once again, this comes from the United States experience. The United States, as a former colony of the United Kingdom, I like to say from my own experience with people who are British and my own experience traveling in the UK, that everything we learned it from the UK, our cousins, our partners in the UK. And so it was really clearly on display during the whole COVID thing, as it's still unfolding, watching what's going on in the UK and watching the United States and seeing how we act very similarly. I mean, you can kind of see how these kind of things unfold. But I say that because I presume that many of the people who are listening are in the UK and are listening from the UK. But you can definitely understand from your own experience with your own nation's history, right, that this whole colonialism thing was set up so that folks could make profits through different kinds of investments on different kinds of labor and different kinds of resources around the world. And that places like the United States for a certain period of time were colonial possessions, right? And in order to make that entire system work, there's a very complicated interplay between power and class and politics to set up a system where some individuals end up having disproportionately more access to resources, more access to political power, and more access to opportunities than others. And in the case of the United States, persons of European descent, persons who take on the identity of whiteness. So in the case of the United States, that's certain political and religious beliefs, right? It's not just white skin color. But once those individuals take on that identity of whiteness, then they're given a slightly better legal and political and social treatment than people who are considered non-white. And then, of course, the phenotypic of expression of human beings that have more melanin, that have different eye shapes, different body shapes, different facial shapes, those are the ones who are considered not white. And so, to try and talk about archaeology as a pure science without acknowledging this, at first, it diminishes the identity of all of us as archaeologists, right? As people who don't have a human identity and aren't part of society, right? But it also avoids the origins of archaeology, because especially in the United States, these excavations and emphasis on looking at Native American heritage and history was specifically designed to identify Native people as different tribes, different historical groups, cultural historical groups, but also to solidify their identity as Native Americans rather than Americans that should get full access to all the legal system. And so we watched all this stuff unfold, and we're the people we're the descendants of all this. We're the ones who inherited this entire legacy. And so, it's not that this is good or bad, it just is what it is, right? This is where we're at. It only becomes bad if we do nothing to try to fix this. So the second point too about the color blindness, given what I just said about all of us growing up in these Western societies where we have all been racialized, individuals of European descent have been racialized, people of non-European descent in the United States and all around the world have all been racialized, right? Through this anthropological system of how we have our own identities. They're being created by our own values and the way that we carry ourselves in the world, that are also able to be interpreted by people who are familiar with our culture and then reify that identity, right? So, this Venn diagram is just showing it's a very simplistic way to depict an extremely complicated and culture-based system by which we all recognize each other. Now, in the case of some identities, a lot of times religion or political belief, you can't necessarily look at an individual and tell that that's the identity that they assume for themselves, or that's the identity that they practice in public and private. You can't just see that by looking. But in the case of people who have been racialized, that have a phenotypic expression that's not considered European, there is no escape from that kind of thing. I'm Black because I'm Black, because I have African descent, and I live in a society that has recognized that as a specific social identity. If I go to African countries, I do not have that same identity, right? I have a much different identity. So the other part about people who are reluctant to address this as far as archaeologists, not only is it diminishing our own identities as individuals, it's also kind of taking a end run or avoidance of the actual anthropological fact of how we are existing in this world, right? It's failing to even recognize that these systems are at play, whether we're awake or whether we're asleep, whether we're saying anything or not, whether we're just sitting on the subway or not, right? So once again, we're not colorblind because we're part of this entire system. And as anthropologists, as archaeologists, this is something that we all can understand. Now, how this unfolds in archaeology in the United States. It was mentioned before that most of my career was spent doing archaeology in the cultural resource management industry. That's what CRM means there. It's very similar to the heritage resources management system in other countries. I believe, I'm speaking out of turn without knowledge, but I believe there's a parallel system in the UK. In the United States, people from the Canelo Group, which is a nonprofit that studies the cultural resource management industry in the United States, came to the conclusion that in 2020, about more than $1.4 billion was being spent on archaeology in the United States, on cultural resource management. Now, that wasn't direct archaeological excavation, but that was the entire industry, all the overhead, all the other management, and all the other supplies that were needed to do compliance with historic preservation laws in the United States. We were spending that much money on it. And we're also spending quite a bit on academic archaeology. 43 million in 2020 is an estimate. And I don't have the numbers for 2021, but I believe that has increased, and that many in the cultural resource management industry are optimistic because we've passed some infrastructure packages that have the potential to give even more money to cultural resource management. The same group estimates there's between 7,600 and 11,000 archaeologists in the United States. Based on this estimate, that is including individuals who are faculty at universities that work for research groups at universities. And there's an estimate that more than 80% of that 11,000 or 7,600 is working in the private sector. So altogether, we've got a pretty small group of people in the United States that is, behind a huge amount of money. And if you think about it, when we're talking about being in compliance with laws before construction and before development, you can see how there's a really central place that this industry plays, because there's a lot of large projects that can't go forward without meeting the state and local regulations for mitigating adverse effects to historic properties. So you got this 11,000 people that are, pretty important to our economy in the United States. And the Department of Labor in the United States projects we need at least a 5% increase in the number of archaeologists. So that's to, not just cover retirements, that's more than we currently have to cover the expansion of the needs in the United States for archaeologists. And then if you look at the other side, our archaeology organizations in the United States have surveyed who is behind all this money and who's doing all the work. And or maybe surprisingly, I'm not sure if folks are surprised, about 90% of the archaeologists in the United States that respond to these surveys are white. going back to 1997, the Society for American Archaeology publishing a report that said that there was 89% of the people who responded to their survey were of European descent, and only 2 individuals who responded to that were Black. Fast forward 20 years or so, still about the same proportions, but there's 4 Black people who responded to the survey. The Society for Historical Archaeology recently did another survey, and they've also found that there was about 89% of the people who responded to that were white, with 8 Black people who responded. But more recently, the Society of Black Archaeologists did a survey, and there's about 235 members of the Society of Black Archaeologists, and 85 people responded. 69 people were of African descent, 25 white. So what we can see here is there's, well, a couple of things in these responses, right? That there's a pretty big industry that a small number of individuals in the United States is controlling actually a lot of power over designating things eligible for the National Register, conducting archaeological data recovery, generating a lot of information about the past in the United States. And that's being controlled largely by people of European descent. But that somehow there's a larger group of individuals of African descent who are actually doing archaeology, but they're not showing up in these professional organizations. So we may not actually, in fact, know how many Black archaeologists there are in the United States. And it could possibly be that the professional organizations and just the profession in general is not amenable to African American people being part of it. Now, this slide builds on scholar that I've been following for a while, Ruth King, who's doing a lot of work, anti-racist work, trying to create systems where people can actually address the lack of diversity or diversity issues in the workplace. And some of these things that come from this, I put this list out there because it's 6 things. It's really easy for us all to actually look at this kind of stuff. But in my own experience and the experience of other people of African descent who do archaeology, I've seen at least these 6, if not more, things end up happening to people of color who are working in these archaeology organizations or trying to set out a career of archaeology, right? So the idea, of course, that people of color end up representing their entire race or their entire group in an all-white setting, whereas white people always get to represent just themselves. So when an individual acts out, it's not them actually acting as a white individual, it's them just acting out as an individual, right? Also, a lot of pressure for people of color to fit into a dominant culture that, by definition, we've ended up becoming our own race because of that entire culture and that entire system. That's why we are African American rather than just Americans. And so when you end up in a situation where it's all white people and you're the only Black person, then you're supposed to try to fit into something that you actually don't fit in, and structurally it's not designed for you to fit into. And then the stars and constellations, right? Like African Americans see aggressions and other kinds of ways of closing individuals out, and disproportionate allocation of resources and labor as part of the overall structure that makes it more difficult for Black professionals, rather than it just being a one-time event. So if an African American is supposed to design an entire diversity and inclusion measure at their company because they're African American, or because it's presumed that people of European descent cannot be anti-racist and cannot do this work, then that's a lot of labor that's added onto that individual. And the Black person will see that as just another way of this all unfolding, versus not, white people might see this is just an individual incident, right? Having good intentions and not seeing the impact of their actions. I already brought that entire thing up with the whole anti-racist statements that so many organizations have issued, these anti-racism statements. And if you look back, they have not increased the amount of individuals of color who are working there. They have not collaborated with Native American people. They have not connected with Asian American communities. They have done nothing besides just business as usual. And we're in 2022, and they made those statements after George Floyd was murdered in 2020. Just the straight fatigue of being the individual who's the person of color who's bringing this kind of stuff and pushing it forward. That's definitely something that everyone who's on this work has to manage their own workload and their own ability to engage with this kind of stuff, because it's not always positive for us, right? But there's always an inability to understand that, in the background, even behind all of this that's going on, and there's also a whole host of other things going on in society because an individual is of, African descent. And then, of course, the biggie at the bottom where people don't want to engage. They fall apart whenever this kind of stuff is pressured. It's not considered important to the mission of the organization. You know, there's definitely silence when someone acts out, and then also collusion and protection when someone acts out because they're an individual that maybe they just did a bad thing and they're not so bad that this isn't racism. It's just, you know, a bad action and they're very sorry. And then nothing actually moves forward, right? So the sameness is definitely something. The you know, pressure to, you know, think beyond race and don't think about that kind of stuff, that's definitely real. And then just getting weathered down by the overall effect of the emotional toll and physical toll it takes of, you know, pushing in this stuff. And then, you know, I could go on, but I want to switch to something positive. And, you know, the positive thing is you being an anti-racist and an archaeologist is not stupid. So in the United States, we're undergoing an entire new world is unfolding in front of us. From environmental change, right, that I didn't even put on there, that's the most pervasive thing that we have to deal with as an entire species around the globe, right, to the ongoing race uprisings, right, that are constantly unfolding right now. You know, this is a photo of the spot where George Floyd was murdered, and in 2020 we saw this rash of uprisings, right, of property damage and violence and all kinds of things unfolded. And then on Wednesday, in the same town, Minneapolis, the same police department shot a Black man who was asleep on a couch because they had a warrant and he legally had a gun, right? So this is the same town, the same country that has such differential treatment of individuals having guns. Yet another 22-year-old African-American was shot to death in the same town, right? Even 3 years later, we're talking months later. Right now, protests are going on in Minneapolis in the cold against this same police department, right? So this anti-Black violence is around the world. It's pervasive. It's constantly happening. It's happening between Black people and Black people. It's happening between law enforcement and Black people. And it's also happening between Black people and the entire system in which we're working, right? And then COVID-19 just makes it even worse. So I live in a community that's largely people from different Asian countries, China, the Philippines, and I've got a lot of people who are Hispanic and from other countries. That we're all people of color that live on my street here in California. And as I drive around the cul-de-sac in the suburban California neighborhood, I can look and see all these houses where people have lost their businesses and jobs because of the COVID pandemic. People have lost their lives. They've lost their loved ones. People have lost their children because they're no longer able to take care of them. We're stepping up and taking care of each other's children while other individuals have health issues and are dealing with unemployment and all kinds of problems. And that's in like suburban California. That's not the, you know, rundown part of town. But this is the kind of stuff that's happening in the households of people of color. And we still don't even know how this is all going to unfold. And then, you know, I aim here anti-Asian American and Pacific Islander violence because the pandemic has accelerated violence against people of Asian descent in the United States, because there's many individuals who blame people of Asian descent as the reason why we have a pandemic, the reason why the economy is this way, and the reason why all this stuff is unfolding. So if you are an anti-racist, you know, you are actually with clear eyes looking at the reality of the world in which you live, right? And this is the world in which archaeologists are doing our work. We're not just robots that dig and write, you know, extremely boring articles that even our own parents won't read. We're human beings, we're citizens, we're parents, we're colleagues, we're neighbors. And even if this isn't happening in your own town, it is still happening to you because you live in the same world in which I live. And every time there's thousands of people who don't have access to healthcare, pandemic continues. Every time people don't have access to education and money, they end up susceptible to violence, right? So anti-racism is just the empathetic response and being wise and intelligent, reading the world in which you live and recognizing that this is one thing that we definitely need to address. All right. In a situation like this, you know, we all find ourselves in a situation where in our own community, harm is happening to others because of capitalism, because of racism, the pandemic, however you want to slice the cake, right? Some of us are ending up being survivors, right? Some of us are actually causing that through our own actions. And many of us are standing back and watching this, right? So this isn't like a contest on who's suffering the greatest or whatever, because even if you're sitting there watching suffering, you're losing empathy and your own ability to engage in a compassionate way with other human beings. So as you sit there and watch that stuff go down, you also are part of that too. It's also positional, right? It's not Olympics where you're trying to compare how badly someone has been harmed, right? We're just living in this world and this stuff is happening. So we need to find some kind of a way to act, right? This is the reality in which we live. More individuals who are sitting on the sidelines need to get in a situation where they're actually heroes, where they are supporting survivors. And the way that we can, short circuit this entire structural loop in our economy, in our society, in our universities, classrooms, where we're at, right, is by taking away the space for individuals to cause harm, by more individuals supporting survivors, fewer bystanders, more people actively supporting those who are being harmed, right? So moving into that hero situation, right? So that we can get to the space where there's only people who are surviving and only people who are supporting each other. I mean, this is the beautiful society that Martin Luther King was talking about. This is the space that many religious traditions, many different organizations in our societies have been telling us since we're children. This is basically heaven, right? This is people supporting each other and working together to provide a situation for us all to move forward. If folks are concerned about critical race theory, then they're really going to have their brains blown out by critical anti-racist theory. So the first thing is to acknowledge the harm that's being caused by the system that we're in, right? I'm only focusing in this talk on dividing individuals by their phenotypic expression and considering that race. Of course, we can extrapolate this much further, right? But acknowledging that this is baked into our systems is the very first step, right? And then the next step is to address it by taking all the supports away from that and building a new strong structure, either in its place, next to it, or in another space, right? Because the goal is to diminish discrimination, diminish the kind of things that make it so archaeology is not the kind of place that people of color want to be, right? To create that more inclusive social framework. And in the process, you end up helping your own community, your own profession, and you end up making your job a place that you want to be. Now, once again, I'm coming back with the 6 lists, right? So this is coming from some work, some anti-racist work that I've been researching that talks about creating frameworks for supporting students of color and for reframing anti-racist theory in a way that is more applicable in a lot of different social sciences, right? So I've just taken these 6 out of here because these are the 6 elements that I've seen identified. And of course, in your own life, you can see different ways that you can add on to this, right? But when we're talking about anti-racism, you need to start with the fact that you're part of the system and that this has happened to you and that you were born into this thing. And from the time you were born, this is something that's been happening to you. It's not just for people of color. It's happening to white people as I speak right now, right? And that affects your identity, and you carry that with you as you carry yourself through the world. And that identity is built on this long legacy and this history. We didn't get to this place overnight, but here we are, right? So there is a history behind this, and that this intersects with so many different aspects of our society. Like I said, class and politics, but there's a million brilliant scholars who are teaching me more every day on how this connects with age, how this connects with sexual orientation, how this connects with where you live in the world, right? Constantly learning more, but I'm learning that it's all interwoven together into a meshwork that's, it's part of who we are, right? The system also requires us to think of people as other. And as long as we don't think of them as part of our community, as human beings, as colleagues, people that we want to be with, then there's always the space for us to care less, for them to not be the kind of person that we want to stand up for. And then, of course, the elephant in the room when we're talking about archaeology, that 90-something% of the archaeologists are of European heritage that are white. So if you're going to see any of this stuff happen in archaeology in our lifetime, it's going to start with that 90%. It just is not enough. If there's 8 members of the Society for Historical or Society for American Archaeology that are African American, we cannot ask those 8 to stand up and create an anti-Black violence platform. That is not enough for the entire organization. So if any of this stuff is going to happen, it actually is all in the lap of people of European descent So this is coming from Melvin Escobar's work on trauma-informed healing, which I've been looking at a lot and using a lot of these different ideas as inspiration for my own work and my own discussions about being more inclusive in archaeology. But one of the things that Mr. Escobar explains is that you see these 5 aspects here that are foundational to any kind of anti-racist effort. This has been modified slightly, but you can start at any place in this spectrum, right? Because all of us are in these different places, right? All of us are in these places where we're putting in some form of effort, right? Where we actually have some kind of insight in what's going on, and that we have some level of confidence, and that all of this stuff builds on its own self. So no matter where you're at, you can start by focusing on yourself. You can start by reading and getting insight to what people of color are writing as researchers, right? You can actually start doing something. And from all of that, you'll be aware of more things that can be addressed, and you'll have more confidence to address this. But the key thing to remember, as someone who's coming from the United States, everything I see is just, shaped by my own personal experience as being a U.S. citizen. So it's really difficult for me to come up with solutions for folks from the UK or from the different places where I do research, because I'm not from there. But the beauty is, there's many different creative ways that people who are willing to go on this path and are willing to become anti-racist and anti-racism advocates, they can all build something that's just the right size for their community, that works for them. But at the end of the day, it all starts with individuals, right? You can stay anti-racist and watch this whole train, running people over, or you can actually try to get in and apply the brakes and stop the carnage. Now, I'm just going to share, I think I'm getting low on time here, but I'm going to share a couple of ways of how this is working out amongst myself and my colleagues on a couple of projects that I'm part of. One of them is some ongoing research that I've been part of, blessed to be part of, in the Virgin Islands. That's part of an initiative from the University of California's Historically Black Colleges and Universities Initiative, which is a fund that provides funding to recruit students who are going to African American or historically Black colleges and universities to work with scholars in the University of California system. It's to get undergraduates experience in the field or in labs, so that they can hopefully go on to graduate school, and we hope that they would apply to one of the University of California. So there's several different UCs here, and folks who are accepted to this program, they get their application fees to graduate school waived by the University of California system. And if they get accepted into graduate programs, they get some funding from the UC system. And in the case of ours, we're doing a community-based archaeological project with Afro-Crucian heritage conservation folks there on the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. Our project also includes a community program where local Crucian youth in middle and high school come and learn about archaeology, but they also see a bunch of other Black college students. The Virgin Islands needs inspiration and needs to see the example of some of these Black students, so that more and more of their folks will go on to college. They don't have the same university capacity as many of the United States, but folks who live in the Virgin Islands are US citizens. And so going to the mainland with all these different universities is a big step for a lot of folks from the islands. And so the hope is that folks will go on to college, folks will learn about archaeology, but in the end they'll also be advocates for historic preservation, because the work we're doing is trying to connect communities to these heritage sites that have been they haven't really had the access to, and they haven't been able to use archaeology to advocate for conservation. Overall, we have ended up, it was by design, but it ended up better than we could have imagined. We have created a space that is safe for Black students and Black archaeology scholars to be ourselves as we do archaeology, which is an extremely rare thing in archaeology in the United States. Another long-term project that I've been part of is several heritage conservation projects in the city of Boise, Idaho, where I'm from. And the one that I'm talking about here focus on work in the River Street neighborhood, which was the site of, I started a heritage conservation, a digital heritage project to collect archival information and digitize it and make it available to descendant communities the River Street neighborhood in the city of Boise. So I mean, you probably don't know where the state of Idaho is, but the state of Idaho has about 2 million people that live there. And I think 0.01% of that is of African descent. And the city of Boise has, I would say, I want to say there's like 3,300 African American people who live in the city of Boise, and it's a town that has 250,000 people. This neighborhood, before the rental restrictions and homeowner restrictions were void in the United States, it was the only place that people of African descent could live. And so during the 20th century, this neighborhood that had a few Black families, but mostly poor white, European immigrant. There were some Japanese families and some Basque families that also lived in this neighborhood. And the archaeology project really kind of chronicles the experiences of people of African descent, poor whites, and Basque in this neighborhood. And as part of that, in 2015, there was a public archaeology project where about 47 individuals from the community, including students, volunteers, children with their parents, there were people from a homeless shelter, there was all these different individuals who all came to do an archaeology project where they all learned about historic artifact identification. And they also learned about archaeological method and theory. And that taking place in that neighborhood was unavoidable for them to talk about segregation, Blackness, whiteness, and all those things, othering people of European descent. So all of that stuff took place in a kind of situation where, people who don't have an opportunity really to engage with that kind of stuff, it was unavoidable on that project. It was the field component had a cultural anthropological component that was administered by the College of Western Idaho, and then a field school administered by the University of Idaho Archaeological Field School. So students got a chance to listen to elders, give testimony about their lives in the neighborhood. Those were recorded. Students got to see people from the neighborhood talk about who their neighbors were and record all these different things as a cultural anthropology project. And then if they wanted to, they could switch over and do archaeological excavation that was happening on the same property. So it was a really interesting situation that turned out quite well. And largely, this project contributed heavily to an ongoing preservation project to protect that house that's being shown in that picture there. That house was owned by an African-American family. African-American matriarch named Irma Heyman purchased that house after World War II. And it was the only, at the time when we were there, it was the only house on about 8 city lots on the entire block. And the plan at the time in 2015 was to move the house. But after the archaeology and after so many people came to the site and saw what was going on, it was donated to the city of Boise, and it's right now being rehabilitated into the first in-place African-American historic property in the state of Idaho. Well, no, in the city of Boise. There's a couple others in the state of Idaho, but it's definitely one of the few African-American historic properties in the state. And so I'm still part of the project that is helping with the interpretation and the community engagement of this property as we move forward. Okay, and to get to the last one that I mentioned, there's definitely a place that those who don't want to engage in this can go, but I don't need to say out loud where that is because they're already well on the path. As our society changes and as archaeology itself, what people think is interesting, what people are interested in practicing, as all of that stuff changes, those who want to fight against inclusion and think that it's identity politics anymore to do this kind of stuff are already moving themselves into a place of less and less relevance. And as our universities struggle to recruit students, just any students, and as archaeology departments across the United States struggle to stay open, those departments that are not inclusive and are not connecting to communities are moving themselves closer and closer to extinction, because it's difficult for the university of the 21st century to think that it's appropriate to spend funds on a department that is actively segregating itself from the rest of the country. And then talking about cultural resource management, right now there's a labor shortage in cultural resource management. And if we don't find some kind of a way to expand the net of students that are going into anthro programs to get the skills to learn how to be archaeologists, the entire field of cultural resource management is in jeopardy, right? So as we fail to be more inclusive, as we fail to invite millions of people who have never even thought one time about becoming an archaeologist, as we continue to ignore that entire demographic, we're just fading away. And so, we can either fade away, or we can actually uh, join the tide of where our society is going, of trying to create a more empathetic and inclusive world. And it's not just archaeology here, but if archaeology stays on the pathway, it's not going to exist in the future. I'm getting close to the close here. And one of the ways to think about it, of course, I just gave this talk for 45 minutes about archaeology, but this is just one tiny grain of activity that's going on in a world that is changing faster than anyone has ever imagined. It's been thousands of years since the human species had to deal with the kind of stuff that we're dealing with, and we are the ones who get to live in this kind of situation. And so it's really easy as we move forward to just think about, what are the issues that we can address in archaeology? How can we focus on this one individual tree and nurture it, right? By forgetting that it's part of an entire forest, that all this stuff is interconnected. It's great that we can, as archaeologists, focus on our one thing that we're doing and cause this kind of disproportionate impact. With so few of us doing all this historic preservation work, connecting that to communities and being more inclusive of their thoughts and their ideas and their own people in things like cultural resource management, all of a sudden turns $1.4 billion of box checking into a community asset. As we start doing the kind of research that engages communities to help them write actual histories, that they've never gotten a chance to write history and never gotten a chance to be part of it, they create something that they can pass down to their children that's in their own words that their children can understand, not our words, their words. That $43 million of archaeology research goes from just learning more about bottles and sherds into something that people in a community can actually take ownership of and be proud of and tell their children in the future. So, why should you even be an anti-racist? I mean, in short, to keep archaeology from just fading away and going into, the dustbin of something that only the wealthy antiquarians of old can possibly do. But first, by being a citizen and thinking about what you can contribute to your own community, you have a chance to connect students who have never even one time thought about doing archaeology. You can get them into that pipeline of professional training that leads them into archaeology, that gets them to be professional archaeologists and helps them in return add to the cycle. They get to connect to communities, not even their own. In my case, it's not always the community I grew up in that I'm connecting to. It's not even the community I live in, right? But the whole goal is to try and make archaeology relevant, because in the United States, we pay for archaeology through cultural resources, whether we like it or not. Our universities are spending money on archaeology, whether it makes a contribution to the community or not. By doing that and turning archaeology from just a practice of measuring change in the past to an actual good for society, that's how we actually change the entire situation. And so the first step starts by recognizing the structures that are preventing us from doing this. What are the structures that prevent us from connecting with communities of color? What are the hurdles that we have recruiting students? How is the professional training system we already have preventing diversity in archaeology? And how is that preventing the entire thing from adding to more beneficial conditions in archaeology? And so I'll close here with going back to the whole idea that it's you changing the way that you think about, right? So there hasn't always been a space like there is today where collaborative cooperation with communities for archaeological research that's accountable and gives back to communities. That hasn't actually been a thing for very long in archaeology. And it really required people to think about the fact that there's more than one way to see the world. It's interesting, as anthropologists, many of us just weren't really focused on that, right? But realizing that there's a wealth of different ways to see the world, and that there's a wealth of different ways that archaeology can be successful, and to actually be honest with communities, right? Ours is the craft that is full of repositories of other people's ancestral remains and heritage property. That was gotten a lot of times not by honest communication with people of color, and by thinking that there's a way that we can both have archaeological data while also giving back to communities, just changing the entire way that you practice yourself, both inside your institution and outside of it too. I mean, this is going to take a decent amount of effort from a lot of us to make any of this actually come to fruition. But what's great is through the pandemic, through all of this stuff, it was like the match that started a wildfire of this kind of stuff happening right now. And as we go into the conversation, I can tell you about several other programs where folks are doing exactly this, where they are internalizing this and they're actually practicing it, and they didn't even see this talk today. Okay, so in conclusion, how can you help in the United States? There's several different mechanisms. Learn about Black Lives Matter from actual Black Lives Matter, not from Facebook. Try to stop Asian American Pacific Islander hate. That's one way to address the actual ongoing racialized violence that is accelerating in the United States. To try to work through the legal system with the ACLU, support the ACLU as it tries these different cases in the United States, but then bail us out when we get arrested. So support the National Bail Fund Network. Right now, folks in Minneapolis, I have a feeling they could use this. So if you've got some spare cash, find a way for that to go into one of these organizations. And that's one step closer to you, realizing that kind of world where we are more inclusive and we are actually active anti-racists without the hyphen. Thank you, everybody. That's all I've got right now. I will stop sharing my screen and I am open to any and all questions.
Bill, thank you so much. That was really well put together. And I think you tied together that whole real kind of entangled system of how we try to recruit people into the profession of archaeology, and starting from the ground up with community work and trying to dismantle the image, which is not wrong, of archaeology as a kind of a white person's sphere. I just wanted to ask you, I'll warm up the questions quickly by just asking you, have you had any success so far with students of color coming into, have you seen any increase of students of color coming into and going on to perhaps postgraduate programs in your personal experience or in other colleagues' experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I don't actually have the metrics on that. I don't know if there's necessarily an increase, but I mean, it's a complicated issue just in general. I have seen students who have been on these projects take anthropology classes. They get their parents out there and they do archaeology. And so if you're thinking about trying to get people of color to do archaeology, yeah, I have seen many families get their grandparents out there to share information that we don't know about. And for that time being, without them going to university, they are practicing archaeology. They're there with archaeologists doing the real job. So in that way, I have seen more of that happen. What I've seen is better support systems for the students of color that we already have. So the numbers as far as students going on to university in general in the United States is getting more and more bleak. The pandemic did a huge number to families of color economically. And we're going on 2 years of students not really having full school yet, and we don't really even know what's going to end up happening to our students of color just even going to college, right? But these networks, I have seen students of color have a place to call. They have people to talk to, and I spend quite a bit of time at least a couple times a month talking to students of color in universities in the United States, talking to them about their experiences of being in white only departments, of being in communities where they have no one really to talk about, where they're coming into a program and having to pick up an entire racial and social justice platform from day one, and somehow still graduate from college, graduate from graduate school, right? So here at Berkeley, I'm in a different kind of bubble because our students in anthropology are diverse, and it's a university that's not seeing a decrease in the amount of admissions. So my students, I'm seeing them, just a normal amount, but it's me seeing students from other universities, I'm seeing a lot more increase of that. And that's by us building these kind of support networks. One of the biggest activities of the Society of Black Archaeologists is just having a place for Black students and scholars to just talk to each other without white people there. I mean, that didn't exist before that society was created for archaeologists. And that's been something that has really helped keep students in the game, because we had all students have a lot of trouble in college, finishing college. But for students in something like anthropology, where they could be all alone and be learning the kind of things that they think are racist, right? That causes a different kind of strain. So I haven't seen a larger number of students of color going into anthropology departments, but I've seen better retention and more connection of the students that are already there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I was also rather struck by your pointing out about the discrepancy between the number of Black archaeologists that can be picked up by the SBA versus the SAA and the SHA, for instance. But I'm not going to hog questions. I'm sure some other people would like to. Ashley Davis in the chat has asked whether he may ask a question. Please go ahead, unmute and ask away.
So in the UK, proper anti-racism is getting a bit difficult at the moment because the government is relatively hostile. There's been a few cases where academics who were anti-racist were denied director positions on museum panels. And there is legislation where now if you're considered inclusive to the public good, you can be deported. Even if you have a citizenship in the UK, even if you are a UK citizen, and then there's other things coming into effect, and it's how do you? The question I have is not just for you, William, but for all the other people here is like, how do you support? How can you get anti-racism going in an environment where people who are the most affected might be not willing to speak out because of that potential threat?
Very good question. Does anybody have any comments on that? Maybe some other people who work in field archaeology in the UK that have ideas, other university archaeologists? I mean, from my opinion, Ashley, I think you've just got to take the risk as somebody who has a platform and the ability to take a risk. But I say that from the word privilege is becoming too cliched. You can't really use it with any effect anymore. But I have a cushion. I have the ability to take a risk, which is not something that everybody has. And I might find that I don't have that ability to take a risk if I suddenly get fired and my mortgage isn't paid. But yeah, I think you've just got to be a bit bloody minded. I also, however, think that there is something to be said about the way that you communicate with people who are very hostile to this project, if you want to call it a project, because it's really sort of multi-stranded. It's really just, ethics to me, sort of basic ethics. But, some people feel very threatened by it, and I think it is important to try and figure out why people are threatened by it, and what's going on with them as well, and include people in the conversation. So people that are trying to run away, sort of grab them by the collar and drag them back and say, why are you running away? I don't know, actually. Bill, I'd like to know what your opinion on that is. How do you deal with people who are resistant?
Yeah, that's a rough one, right? Because there's such a power differential, right? Like, I work for the state of California, and there's a million things that if I do, it's not going to be so great for my job. So, I think that everyone should just work to their own capacity, right? Because the idea would be that over time, more and more people would have heard this message, and that more and more people would have internalized these concepts as necessary for them to survive, right? Because I think, speaking once again to the United States, what we're seeing is there's a certain political, faction that recognizes that their narrative is coming to an end. Like, it's difficult, more and more difficult for them to support their political platform. They have fewer and fewer followers of people who, are interested in that. And so you see all kinds of gymnastics happening to do everything they can for that last grasp, because they can see demographically, our entire country is just leaving them behind. And so right now they're just scrambling to maintain that control. And so you see it on play in a lot of different ways in our political system. But one thing to think about is that eventually it's going to tire out. Eventually they won't have the same support, right? Now that doesn't mean that they can't do incredible harm before they finally run out of gas, right? It could totally happen, and our whole thing could be in an absolute shambles. And then here we are with just our trowels, and we're all going to Catherine's because she's the last one with a home left, and we're living in her yard, right? Because we lost all our homes. Now that can absolutely happen, but I do strongly feel like, just if you look at the kind of articles that are being published in historical archaeology, and you look at the approach that's happening in current anthropology and a lot of these different journals, just look at what's happening over the last 10 or 20 years. Look at who's getting hired to these different departments. Look at what people are publishing and how people think about old research too. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of really incredible revisions of a lot of things that we once knew in archaeology that are coming from folks who have different ideas, completely different generation of folks, right? And so I would imagine that would end up happening in our overall society as, in the United States, people that are highly educated are moving to different parts of the country where they're more conservative and they have different political values, but they're going to look for those same kind of social assets that they enjoyed living in more diverse urban communities, right? And so you can imagine what's going to happen with these people who aren't as local with these same conservative ideas will move into these zones, and then all of a sudden you start to see over time. And our last election, national election, you can kind of see that states that were purely for Donald Trump just 4 years ago were very closely, switched to the other side. And there's been even 4 more years of people migrating into those locations since then. And when it comes to archaeology, like I was saying before, those folks that have so much power and control over, who gets to do archaeology and who gets funded and who gets to be an editor and all that stuff, they don't last forever. It seems like we all last forever, right? It seems like archaeologists never retire, that eventually it's like in Star Wars, we just disappear and fade into the blankets, right? But the reality is we don't keep editing these journals forever. We don't keep digging forever, and we don't keep advising students forever. We don't stay in archaeology forever. And it can seem like a very long time to wait. It can seem like a very long time to wait for this all to unfold, but you can take the oxygen away by just making your own network stronger and stronger and stronger, to the point where it's difficult for them to get rid of. I mean, what would they do? Get rid of all of the graduate students? Would they fire 5 of the tenured faculty? Would they really defund the entire university? I mean, we're at the point where seriously, this stuff is just being baked into everything. Anti-racist stance is starting to become just a normal way of operating. And there's growing pains going on. So I don't really have any answer specifically to the UK situation about deporting individuals. That's just so cruel and tragic. And, many people in the United States get deported too for really cruel, reasons too. I don't really have a solution to that. But I mean, my thing is just to be optimistic and share this message with more and more people and try to collaborate with more and more people until there's just not very many of them left.
Thank you, Bill. Michael Rivera in the chat has posed a kind of comment and a question. Michael, would you like to actually unmute and come in with observations and questions? Feel free to put in the chat if you don't. Some people feel quite shy about unmuting.
Well, also sometimes people are driving, right? So, I can read the question.
Okay.
I wouldn't want this.
But anyway, Michael was speaking as an Asian bioarchaeologist, and he was thinking. Sorry, I'm using pronouns willy-nilly here. I don't know what pronouns Michael prefers, but thinking about the role of one's feelings in anti-racism work in academia and archaeology. So, there's compassion and love and disappointment and loneliness and discomfort and anger, and how do you view that emotional load, basically the emotional component of working in archaeology, period, I suppose, and then specifically with this kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that emotional load, I'm glad you mentioned that. my goal, because that's the weathering, right, that leads to the fatigue as you have less and less rest. It's not good for your health. You're not going to live very long that way. So for the longest time, it was just anger, right? That just motivated me to get revenge. I still haven't moved past revenge. There's still some people I need to, kill them with success is what I've been trying to do so far. And I haven't quite succeeded past some of the people who I want to get revenge on yet. So fortunately, I still have many more years to go. As you can tell, I haven't worked my way through all of this stuff. But, at a certain point, what ended up happening was kind of looking at those folks and trying to use those emotions as like, a point of observation, right? So for example, let me think. I used to work for a company that will remain unnamed, that just would not let women who had kids go into the field. It didn't matter how good they were. It didn't matter if there was family support at home or, some way. They just were like, you've got a 14-year-old, you need to be home with your kid. And until that child's an adult, you're not going out into the field. So it was never said out loud. It was just strategic, where someone was, the editor of the reports, or then they ended up being the lab manager, which meant that only, men end up getting all the opportunities to go in the field, which then we're all patted on the back, and, we get to rise up higher and higher, right? And so there's definitely a level of anger to see my colleagues not get promoted and me work there, and just by being a man, moving up, and then to trying to find ways to get them into the field, to get them out there, right? And so there was just a lot of anger, but uh, at a certain point, I had to just kind of think about like what had happened to my supervisors and the people who own this company, to put them in the kind of situation where they would just decide that half of the human race is not fit for going into the field because they were a woman. Like, what kind of thoughts go through their head every day as they, walk around discriminating against women while pretending like they're for equity, right? And at a certain point, you kind of have this level of like, kind of sadness, right? That they would just not, that the company would not be doing as well as it is because they just don't want some of their best people to go outside and do the work, and that they won't actually succeed, and they won't move up higher because they don't want a woman to be a success, right? And that kind of like feeling that, man, that's got to be a really kind of twisted position, to know that there's women that are better than you, but you won't let them be better than you because you hold all the cards, right? And so there's this kind of like, just kind of sadness when you look at someone that has that kind of mindset. The sadness that when you look at the kind of person who says that they're against anti-Asian violence and then they do nothing, that every day they must know that they said they were going to do something, and in the back of their mind they know they didn't do anything. Every day, every time they see me after making that promise, they know they didn't fulfill their promise. So they have to live with that every day. They have to live with what's going on every day. And so, yeah, I try to move forward and try to be as, uh, um, equal as possible, while reminding myself that those who are not on this pathway, I mean, no shame, no blame or whatever, are in a different state in their life, and they have a different kind of turmoil going on in their mind that I don't even really have to deal with that.
Thanks, Bill. Ella Bourdoin has a question. She's got her hand up.
Hiya, this is not a super well formulated question, but I would love, one, amazing talk. Two, I'd love your opinions on it. I've been finding, interestingly enough, a lot of like these conversations or wanting to bring up anti-racism within archaeology, I've been met by a lot of other young people with, instead of just like that and completely shutting it down, there's like a lot of like this apathy or this like, oh well, the world's going to shit, so sorry, so I can't do anything about it. And I've always viewed that as like, you just mentioned privilege is an overused word, but it's like often this only comes from other white academics, and especially young. I've met a lot of young white archaeologists who are just like, it feels like they're using it to cover the not wanting to be anti-racist, but also I'm having a hard time trying to engage with people who are using that as like a wall to say, hey, I don't want to do this, or I don't want to work with this. Does that make sense in how I'm phrasing that? I don't know. Is there like,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
yeah, I absolutely hear you. I mean, that's a very real thing that's going on. I used to be young at one time, I think. I don't remember it very well, but I have a feeling that whole whatever, whatever. I mean, we pretty much coined that whole I don't care, whatever. Let's just burn Woodstock down. So that was actually a live experience of my own to try to get people to care about really anything, right? That's something that I remember when I was younger. That was a thing that totally happened, right? So a couple of things, right? And I don't really go that deep in this talk, but one of the things that people of European descent have been, uh, immersed in a system is that the white value in places like the United States is the normative value of human being, right? So when you think about people and family and everything, community, that ends up being in individuals' minds, right? So you're talking about trying to break through everything that is like at the very heart of what a lot of people's identity is. And it is jarring, right? Imagine if somehow gravity went away and then you have to somehow find a way to live as if you were a fish underwater swimming and all these different ways are up. That's what you're dealing with individuals who have never had to engage with this. And so, the key is not necessarily to push people off the cliff. I don't think that pushing someone in the river and then hoping they swim is a functional way, right? Because then down the river, people will be counting the bodies and being like, well, all these people are drowning, rather than looking at the source of why are people drowning? People are getting thrown into the river. The key is to get people close to their own personal boundaries and then give them the space to back off, right? And then have it come up again and again. So a young person is going to have this for the rest of their lives. Someone who's older, this might be just the very beginning of that pathway. They might only now be seeing what's up with anti-racism, anti-Black violence, after living, many, many years without ever having to think about it. So you can imagine a younger person, they may be quite apathetic because you're just looking at the whole situation. Once again, the power dynamic, right? You're just starting off in archaeology. You don't have control over your own employment and labor and all that stuff, right? You don't even have control over what's being taught to you in school. So you can see how it'd be really difficult. However, eventually you'll move into the space where you are the one who's hiring, you are the one teaching the class, you're writing the books, and you're telling other people what they need to know based on your own experience. And so don't assume that just because someone today in their young age says they don't care, that they're not going to care. And also don't assume that grinding someone over this is the most functional way, because they could just, pull back for years and years and never want to ever discuss it. Get to the edge of the void, look in, and then step back. Get a little bit closer and a little bit closer and a little bit closer. It's about immersing yourself slowly until you get to the point where you can actually be out there alone, right? Or to advocate. So I don't want anyone to immediately just start sending off emails, or definitely don't go into social media. That's like swimming in a mining dredge waste pond and calling it a fun afternoon. Don't go into social media. Don't do it. So, just get to spaces, bring it up, gauge your people. They might be so fragile they can't approach it. You're going to find some people who are absolutely willing to go with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Bill. So we've got two other people with raised hands. The first is Heidi Shaw, or Heidi Shaw's iPhone. Heidi, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm one of those people that's just not in a kind of driving situation here. Firstly, thank you so much for the talk today. And I had a question specifically around CRM, and less so about like company culture, but more around terms of the practicality of instituting some of these changes that we'd like to see. But when in reality, CRM is a business, and it's in the States at least, it's a business that's really put forward by the client who's really interested in a minimum viable product. And so trying to institute these changes where you have, what is historically not been stakeholders that have been asked to engage with archaeology. How do you recommend bringing about these changes to get clients to, try and essentially pay for these extra efforts that are beyond like what the regulations say you have to do?
Yeah, that's a huge question, right? Because I dealt with that my entire time in cultural resources. And there's kind of two strategies that I saw other people in cultural resources do. So I don't know if they'll work for your company or not. I mean, one of the strategies is to think about other clients, right? There's Black, Hispanic, Asian property developers. There's Asian countries that are, investing in our infrastructure in our society today. There's Native American tribes that spend millions of dollars a year on cultural resources, right? And it's not just their tribe that's doing all the work. When I was a PhD student at the University of Arizona, we were hired by Native American tribes as their CRM consultants. They paid our contracts, right? So perhaps your company might be missing an entire different segment of the market that is just people of color doing the same thing that developers are doing, right? And then trying to get the clients to pay for things like anti-racism and stuff. I mean, CRM lives and dies by the contract, right? So if you lose contracts, you don't have a job anymore. But one thing that could end up happening, especially if you have these kind of relationships and stuff, is now you all of a sudden have a unique selling position, right? Now you have something else to say because you work with tribes. For an oil company, like, natural gas company, the people who are actively being fought against by Native American tribes to multi-million-dollar lot settlements, that becomes something that you have in actual relationships. You have the skills, knowledge, and ability, and you have professional relationships. And I'm not saying that you'd sell tribes out. I'm saying tribal consultation and working with Black communities is going to save you a multi-million-dollar lawsuit down the road, right? Because whether the archaeologists keep their mouths shut or not, Black people are going to find out who's doing that construction. And if it's breaking historic preservation law and they know about it, you can be pretty sure there's going to be lawyers that'll be involved, right? And so you end up in a situation where they can work with you. And in my experience, the companies that I work for that did this the best, their relationship with Native tribes was a huge asset that they bring to the table for the Department of Defense or for the Department of Energy. And that's what I've seen the most successful CRM companies do, because in order to even get to that point, you need that kind of training, that anti-racism training and equity training for your company. And the company investing in that, it actually becomes something they can make money out of, because they'll be able to, that's one of their selling points, that they can say that they have good relationships with different groups. They have a diverse group of folks that are well schooled in this kind of stuff. And here's the list of the clients that also prove evidence. I mean, that's what I would say. I know 2 companies specifically. If you send me an email, I can tell you which companies they are. And then, you can go from there.
Great, thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill. And Jafar, I think you've had your hand up for a long time. Bill, I don't know whether you know Jafar. He's been doing a lot of work on stuff that's related to decolonizing in Iraq.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, actually, I insisted to attend this this talk, even if we have. I live in Iraq, so it's quite maybe close to the morning. So we have a project actually in Iraq, looking for or studying the Black community in Iraq. We have a Black community. And actually, we have 9 departments across the country. And as long as I see there is no archaeologist in these 9 departments at all. However, we don't have any Black professors at all in all of Iraq universities, but we have a Black community. I can see Black people everywhere in Iraq, in the market, in the farm, everywhere, but I cannot see them in academic life. So when we try to fund a project looking or dealing with a Black community in Iraq, so we didn't find any Black academic to engage with to study the project. So we Iraqis, actually, let's say the brown Iraqis, let's say, are going to study the Black community. Anyway, I found only one professor in Basra, actually retired professor in Basra, and I tried to get him to the project. So my question is, I don't think it's a problem with archaeology. It's actually it's here in Iraq, but it's the problem with the community, of the Black community. They don't go to school, to university. I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. Actually, we Iraqis are now start studying this problem to find out how can we help them to at least go to college or to faculty. So maybe I will email you, Professor White, for more detail, and maybe you can help us in this issue here in Iraq. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for that question, and thanks for staying. It's almost midnight. I'll hurry. Your bedtime is long ago, I presume. Yeah, you know, that's the thing in the United States too, that getting more people of African descent to go to the university. And there is, you know, many reasons why this doesn't happen. But if we don't have more people of African descent going to college, then we have fewer people that could even do an anthropology degree or archaeology, which means we have even fewer people to go through the whole path. Because, you know, I'm just looking at this cast of folks. The folks that I know are, you know, college students, people with PhDs. You all can look back on your life that got you to this point where you're listening to this talk, and think about all the things you had to do to get here, right? Then imagine that accomplishing all those things, but being of African descent in a community where, you know, there's instability, where there's violence, where there's not funding, where you don't have any examples any which way to help you get all the way up. And then you can imagine like where you would want to start. I don't know Iraq's archaeology at all, really. But one of the things I would think about is like, forget having Black professors and scholars do the archaeology. Just get Black people. Just get Black people who live in the community to do it. Yeah, because you can't wait for your grant for you to get PhDs, right? And you can't wait for years and years because the work needs to get done. So in that pathway, perhaps some of those people will go to college. And that's, you know, that's kind of what we do when we work in Black communities. It's not that we want students to go on to be archaeologists. We just want them to go to college or go to graduate school or just do anything more, right, with college. And if hanging out with us and talking about college, other Black people, is something that gives them the experience, you know, that could be it, right? Because I didn't get to where I'm at with Black archaeologists being my main mentors or the people who supported me in college. It was white archaeologists. You know, I had several key Black mentors, but it was like my whole department was white and all my universities, right? My major professor for my PhD is from Ecuador. So it wasn't individuals teaching me all the way up. And all the while I never had any example. So I'm obviously going to be one of the most rare examples. Every archaeologist gets very few opportunities to see archaeology. And so if you can just get folks to connect with that heritage and just do archaeology, for that day, they are archaeologists, right? If you can pay them, that's even better, right? Then they're professional archaeologists. Then they can see that you get paid doing archaeology, and that's something that's worth going to college for. And so that would be my suggestion. Don't wait for people to graduate from a PhD. Just get as many people as you can involved and try to find people of that same community's descent to be the main people that you talk to.
Thank you.
I think that as we're at 8:30, really we should wrap up now, unless somebody really has a burning question that they feel, you know, they'd really like to take this opportunity to ask. If you do, just unmute and jump in. But I think that was a really great discussion to finish up on, because it does bring up this this tension between attracting more students of color by having leaders in the field of color, but then, you know, you don't have so many leaders in the field of color, so you've really got to attract people to archaeology, you know, and get people to understand that it's for them as well, and that goes right to the issue of elitism, really, and academic elitism, intellectual elitism as well, and people feeling alienated from that as well. I'm considering a community project in my neighborhood here as well, which would be, wouldn't really deal with race because my neighborhood is pretty white, but would much more deal with the exclusion that people feel through being, of lesser means, not having education, of having difficulties in life, those sort of things. So it's a part of that as well. Ashley, you want to jump in, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to
be very quick. Sorry. There's been a lot of talk about academic stuff, but what about retention in private sector? Because in the UK, obviously, like America, the UK, there's a lot of private sector work, and the retention rate of archaeologists in general are low, and the retention rate of, I don't think it's been investigated, but the retention rate of people who aren't white is going to be lower. And then that's all to do little things like, I've been very lucky. I've had some very good colleagues, but even, my first day of work, I was told this is a white middle-class profession, and I don't see why we hire people with disability. That was the first thing on my induction day. And I don't know of all of the people who went to university, I don't know any people who weren't white who are still in archaeology from the top of my head.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge thing, and we've only just even begun. One of my colleagues, Doug Rocks McQueen, shared some information a little while ago about.
He's here. I think he's still.
Is he?
Well, he might still be online. Yeah.
Well, maybe. I don't see his name right now.
Yeah, he was here.
Well, yeah. Okay. Well, if he was here, I would ask him to speak up. But I don't see his name. There's a lot of names here. He might be busy though. Anyway, some information that suggests that the shelf life of archaeologists is like 10 years, right? I mean, it takes you that long to get a PhD. It takes you that long to get your, more than that to get your undergrad through PhD. And if it takes you that long and you're only going to last 1 decade, right? Or some other stuff that I've seen that shows that people my age are going to have, 5 to 6 careers in our lives. They're measuring a career by like 3 to 5 years that you do a thing. It's no longer 40 years anymore. So the turnover is throughout our entire society. And as someone who did cultural resources for a long time, I got laid off a lot. I got, on furlough quite a bit. And that's, jarring for just, you're keeping your head above water. And then I wasn't paid as much money, right? So I had a master's degree, and that was the entryway to even get into archaeology. And I wasn't getting paid very much. So that entire situation, I don't even really know where to begin or where to end, because I know some companies that have folks that work there for like 20 something years, and they really take care of their employees, and there's low turnover. And then others that it's assumed that after every single project or every field season, they're going to have to hire all new again. And I don't really know where to meet in the middle there. Of course, as someone who is pro-union, I would put that out there right away, right? Like, I would just say that should be a thing that is, then you actually have the bargaining power. Imagine if the only 11,000 people in your country that can even do all the compliance are all part of a union, and they push for a wage. Like, you can imagine, there's not construction that's going to be happening without people who meet those professional standards and they unionize. However, as someone who's also done archaeology for a while, that union talk has been silenced, every time it's even brought up. The other thing about increasing the wages of consulting archaeologists, that's really difficult. And archaeology has gotten itself in a situation where some organizations are able to just bid preposterous values, and that somehow is accepted by, the client and the government agency. And if that's happening, then it's difficult for you to have a stable, company. So I'm not a company owner. I only know company owners, and I've seen, how hard they work to try to provide a job for anyone to exist. And I've also been there for a long time, and I don't really know the answer. I don't know, because that's the X factor. If I would train, thousands of people over my career to go into a field where they're only going to last 5 years. How ethical is it for me to do that, right? To push people into archaeology, knowing that they're not actually going to do it for very long, or that they won't be able to feed their children. I don't know.
Thank you for answering. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for asking, Ashley. Thank you so much, Bill, for giving this talk and for for giving us your time. And I hope that I can actually meet you in person at some point. And maybe we can get you, to come over to Durham at some point for another talk. And you can actually get to know Durham. But otherwise, thank you so much. I think this has been really, really fruitful, and I'm really glad that you were able to, talk to practitioners here in the UK, and as far away as Iraq. It's a real international
That's incredible
meeting, and I'm really very grateful. So thank you very much, guys, for attending. This will be recorded, and I will find a way of getting the recording available to everybody. I think we have a YouTube channel for the department, so it'll probably be through there. But I will let attendees and all those who registered who couldn't make it know, and I'll spread the word otherwise. And I bid you good night, good day, good lunch hour, whichever it is. Good sleep to you, Jafar. And hopefully we will see each other again.
Yeah.
So thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Take care.